This is True News, the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help us God. Two high-level Russian officials delivered more warnings to NATO allies today that continued participation in the Ukraine war could lead to a nuclear war with the Russian Federation. Former President Dmitry Medvedev said on Thursday that NATO countries that train Ukrainian soldiers how to use German tanks are already participants in the war and have become legitimate military targets. Meanwhile, Russia's deputy foreign minister also warned the West that it risks a nuclear catastrophe if it continues to meddle in the war. Mr. Medvedev's remarks were made in his weekly Telegram blog. We will read the English translation after we look at this RT headline.
And starting us off today, this is from RT. Ex-Russian president, that's Mr. Medvedev, names red line for direct war with NATO. The story is going that the Canadian German troops teaching Ukrainians how to use Leopard tanks already qualifies as participation in the conflict, but sending fighter jets to Poland would mean direct entry. And that's coming from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. You said that earlier today. Medvedev, who is also the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, warned the U.S. and its allies that they can be treated as parties to the conflict if, in addition to supplying weapons, they train personnel to operate them. And he makes his reasoning on this, Rick, based on legal precedents from the 20th century, and we'll be talking about that.
Which is the typical Russian method.
Right.
They'll do it legally.
Yes.
They'll go to war, but they'll do it legally. And they'll cite the legal precedents from past wars to justify their war.
Right.
But what Mr. Medvedev said today, and we're going to read his entire Telegram blog that he posted earlier today. There's two things. Well, I'll say three things. He said that the Western nations that are training Ukrainian soldiers to operate German tanks, those Western nations are automatically participants in the war.
Right. In other words, Russia, if they wanted to, they could justify a response based on their participation.
Don't have to do another thing. You've already crossed the line. That's it. That's what Medvedev is saying. Number two, he said those Western nations are legitimate military targets, not their tanks, although they're going to hit their tanks and so forth. The nations themselves, right. Germany, France, the United States, so forth, legitimate military targets. That means Washington, D.C., Paris, Berlin. And then number three, he said, if the West sends fighter jets to Poland to be used in Ukraine, that's the red line, and there will be no more discussion. That's it.
Now, some would say that Russia's being hot-headed in this, but I would say, and not necessarily defending Russia in this, I would actually say they're showing restraint, because right now, the West has already violated two of the principles of the conflict. And so Russia is actually showing restraint and saying, we could move now if we wanted to, we'd be justified in it, but we're giving you an opportunity now to back away and rethink this whole situation.
Yes. And Doc, this isn't the words of a Russian TV talk show host.
No, this is the ex-president of the country and the deputy head of the Security Council, the War Council, basically, making these statements.
Let's read his telegram. We'll go through it line by line.
So this is from Mr. Medvedev on his Telegram channel. Western analysts reluctantly acknowledge that when NATO specialists teach the Ukronazis,
that's a new one.
Yes, how to use their military equipment in combat, this can be seen as direct involvement of NATO in the military conflict on the side of the Ukrainian regime.
Okay, let's just stop right there. Let's examine what Medvedev said today, that he's saying Western analysts have reluctantly acknowledged, they agree with the Russians, that when NATO officials teach Ukrainian troops to use their equipment in combat against the Russians,
right,
that is a direct involvement of NATO in this conflict on the side of the Ukrainian regime, and that means Russia has the right to attack those nations. That's how he opened this up.
Right.
That Russia now is declaring that they have the legal right to attack the United States and Germany and France and Great Britain.
And he is using legal precedent. There are rules of war and legal rulings on war, and he's using legal precedent to make this argument. He says that since the 20s of the last century,
so we're talking about the 1920s.
Right. The understanding has been established that a country can be recognized as a participant in hostilities if, in addition to supplying weapons, it trains personnel to handle it. And that's according to the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928 and the Budapest Resolution to the 1934 Pact. So, as Rick was saying, the Russians will follow the legal precedent to justify where they're coming from in this particular argument.
You know why, Doc? Because after the war, if there are any survivors on the planet Earth, there will be military tribunals.
That's right. And
the survivors of the war will prosecute whom the survivors believe caused the global disaster.
Right. So, Mr. Medvedev explains how this is happening right now. He said, this is how it's happening today. We know that Canadian and German instructors in the EU are already teaching Ukrainian killers how to handle Leopard tanks.
So he just brought Canada into the
That's right.
Target, into the bullseye of Russian nukes. So we have a lot of Canadian viewers that watch True News. As of today, Russia has now named Canada as a legitimate military target.
So he goes on to say in this particular Telegram post, if we imagine that the NATO aircraft delivered in the future will be serviced by their military on the territory of some overgrown Poland, that's the only possibility given the deplorable state of the defense industry in Little Russia, meaning Ukraine there. This would be a direct entry of the Atlantists into the war against Russia with all the ensuing consequences. So what is he saying there? If fighter jets, whether they be F-16s or anything that is given by NATO to attack Russia, that is going to be a direct entry of NATO, the U.S., the West into a war, direct war with Russia. Russia is going to view it that way. You may not agree with it. You may argue about it. You say they're not going to do it. But this is what Mr. Medvedev is saying is their new red line.
It's interesting, Doc, he referred to Poland as overgrown Poland. A few days ago,
I didn't
he
notice.
talked
You're right.
about readjusting Poland's borders. So once again, in the same week, he has made a reference that Poland's borders have been enlarged and they need to be redefined. So the Russians are telling us they're going to attack Poland. And the Poland that survives the war will not be the same shape and size of today's existing Poland. Specifically said NATO aircraft. What are we hearing here in the United States? Congressman Mike McCall of Texas, Lindsey Graham, and other warmongers in this country demanding that President Biden send fighter jets to Ukraine.
Right.
Same thing in Great Britain. The Minister of Defense, Ben Wallace, can't rule, he can't rule out that they're not going to send fighter jets to Ukraine. So that means they've already made the decision. It's just a matter of when.
Right.
What Medvedev said today is, boys, the moment your fighter jets touch down in Poland, we're taking out Poland. Now, Poland is a member of NATO.
Right.
And if a member of NATO is attacked, then Article 5 is invoked, and all NATO nations have to go to war. So, my friends, listen to me. What Medvedev said today is if Biden or the British Prime Minister, what's his name, Sunak?
Right.
If they send these jets to Poland, we're going to bomb Poland. And we know what that means. That means all of NATO is going to come against Russia. We know that, and we're prepared for it, and we're all going to die.
Yes.
That's what he's saying. We're all going to die. You're going to die, we're going to die, everybody's going to die. So go ahead and do it, because we're going to bomb Poland. He said, that's our red line. This is it. There's no more being patient with the West. This is it. You put the jets in Poland, we go to war with NATO. And when we go to war with NATO, everybody dies. This is reality, folks. This is what's happening. Can you process it? Can you accept that this is happening?
I'm Marco Werman. You're with The World. Thank you for making it today. The war in Ukraine seems to cast a long, dark shadow over pretty much all of global politics. That was clear today during the Group of 20 meeting in New Delhi, India. This was a gathering of foreign ministers representing the world's 20 largest economies. U.S. and Russian officials exchanged angry barbs. Still, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did manage to briefly speak with his Russian counterpart on the summit sidelines. Karishma Mehrotra, the South Asia correspondent for The Washington Post, was there. Karishma, what was the mood today as these G20 leaders gathered in New Delhi?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind here is that the ambiance across India, not just in Delhi, has been a lot of internal advertising around G20. So India has been really using this as a moment to put itself on the global map. It's been repainting old monuments. It's been putting up new structures. There's signage across the country covering Big Juhu Beach in Bombay and covering slums in Delhi. And it's mostly Prime Minister Narendra Modi's face.
I mentioned the exchange between Secretary Blinken and his Russian counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Is it fair to actually call it a meeting?
It's a tricky one. It was less than 10 minutes. So Blinken did request to have this sort of side exchange where he jotted down 3 points to Lavrov. One was about U.S.'s support for Ukraine. The second was the Russian decision to suspend its cooperation in START. And the third was Paul Whelan, the former U.S. Marine that's being held in Russia at the moment. But it was a quick one. And we don't seem to know if the Russians did respond in any way. The delegation seems to say no. And so it's probably not appropriate to call it a meeting, but perhaps an exchange.
Right. So hard to tell whether there was even any planning behind it. Does it suggest that there are lines of communication between the U.S. and Russia, or is that too hopeful of a take?
This did not happen in the last G20 in Bali, and Blinken and Lavrov have rare communication. So I think perhaps this is a sign that something new, but we'll have to keep watching to see what type of communication comes. But we know that this is rare and unprecedented. That much we can definitely say.
I'm curious, did the lines of support for Ukraine feel clear at this gathering, or did it feel kind of muddy?
I would say it still feels muddy, especially from the Indian side. I mean, in the press conferences, the Indian minister did not use the words Russia or China. They do sort of want to hedge this neutral positioning that they've been doing since the war began, which is that India does not want to sacrifice this larger historical relationship it has with Russia, its oil dependency on Russia, its military dependency on Russia. So there's a lot of interest that India is balancing here, and that has ruffled quite a few feathers in the U.S. as well, that India is not taking a more strident stand. And it seems like global South countries in general are falling into this pattern of not having a very clear and direct language about the war that I think the U.S. would prefer to see.
When this G20 gathering began, Indian Prime Minister Modi called on world powers to focus not on what divides us, but what unites us. Was that the outcome, though?
Well, that's what they tried to make us focus on. The real thing to look out for is when the leaders come in September to India, will they be able to sign a document like they did in Bali? Will they even be able to use the template from Bali, as we've tried in these ministerial meetings, to say, yes, all countries agree on talking about the war in Ukraine? So we still have a lot to see when the top leaders of these countries come together in September in Delhi.
Karishma, if the outcome from this meeting doesn't bode well for the next big leaders meeting, the G20 later this year, what does that mean for Modi's image?
One thing that I think Delhi has been trying since the war began is they do want to be a mediator. And September is sort of an attempt to prove that. And I think losing the ability to prove that because they're towing the line too much between Russia and the US, I think it could mean perhaps the US putting a harder line down and saying that this is not okay. But I think it's more of a missed opportunity than anything else. It's an opportunity where India really wants to show the US, like, look, I'm not siding with you immediately, but I can exist in between the two of you, and let me try and mediate between this, and let me try and see where the overlap is. That is the test that we'll have to see whether or not it happens in September.
Right, that's the play, but is India's neutrality an advantage for the country, or does India feel like it's being squeezed between two powers, namely Russia and the US?
That's a good question. And I really think that India at this moment feels like it's a strong advantage. And at the moment, being seen in a very strategically improved position. And the other thing that they're stressing often is that we're bringing the voices of the global south to the stage. And so they don't feel like they're being squeezed. They actually feel like they have the upper hand because the US actually has not been very strong in their language against India's position in any way. They seem to be okay with India taking Russian oil, with India continuing to take Russian military technology, and for India not to be having extremely strong language against Russia. And so from the Indian perspective, this actually seems like a strong geopolitical heavyweight positioning that they've managed to rally in this moment.
Since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine last year, it's repeatedly accused Ukrainian forces of carrying out missile and drone strikes on Russian border areas. But until now, there have been no confirmed reports of Ukrainian ground forces infiltrating Russia. Now the Kremlin is alleging that Ukrainian saboteurs crossed into the Bryansk region on Thursday and opened fire on civilians, a claim dismissed by Kyiv as a false provocation. In response to what he said was a terrorist attack, President Putin cancelled a planned trip to the Stavropol region in southern Russia.
The Russian army fights against those who today committed another terrorist attack, another crime. They penetrated the border area and opened fire on civilians. They saw it was a civilian car, they saw civilians and children were inside, and they still opened fire at them.
Our Moscow reporter, Will Vernon, told us what was known about the alleged cross-border attack.
It's certainly very murky. We're not quite sure what happened. What we do know, what officials are saying, the governor of Bryansk region, Alexander Bakhmut, said that a Ukrainian sabotage group had attacked a village and killed 2 civilians. And then we heard from the Russian security service, the FSB, who said that Ukrainian fighters had violated the border and that they were engaged in an operation together with the Russian military to eliminate that group. And then the Kremlin announced that President Putin was cancelling a planned trip he was due to make to Stavropol region in the south of Russia. And then the president appeared by video link and called the incident a terrorist attack. And then we heard from the security service again saying that the situation was now under control. So it's not really clear what exactly happened, who was responsible. The Ukrainians have denied that they were involved. But clearly this was a very serious incident that happened in Bryansk region today. And I think that will cause a lot of worry, a lot of concern to ordinary Russians that the war is creeping closer and closer to their doorways, because although we've seen a lot of drone attacks, explosions, unexplained incidents in these border regions, this is really quite a serious incident, I think.
As you say, there have been previous accusations from the Russians. The Ukrainians are dismissing this as simply a false flag operation designed to boost flagging support in Russia for its so-called special military operation. Do you think that might be a possibility?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, we don't really know much about this group. That reports have come out that this is some sort of Russian partisan group, or that it was Russians fighting on the side of Ukraine that have then crossed into Russia to carry out this attack. We don't really know, but what is clear is that something unusual happened in Bryansk region today, and I think that a lot of officials in the Kremlin will be nervous, because for many years President Putin, has sold his regime to the Russian people as one of stability, one of security, and so when these incidents happen, that really does shake that foundation of stability that President Putin has constructed as an image over so many years for ordinary Russians.
And what do you think the people in the affected regions are going to make of all this?
Well, it's interesting, my colleagues and I actually travelled to Belgorod region, which is one of these areas that borders Ukraine, a few weeks ago. We heard almost constant booms in the background. But what was interesting is that local people, many of them really didn't make the connection between President Putin launching his so-called special military operation 1 year ago and the situation they were in now, i.e. the loss of security and shelling audibly in the city centre, for example, in Belgorod. Because a lot of people believe the propaganda on Russian state TV, which tells them that it was the West and Ukraine that threatened Russia, that was aggressive to Russia, and it was them that started the war. Whereas, as we know, 1 year ago, Russia launched an unprovoked attack on Ukraine and not the West and Ukraine. So it was interesting that there was that disconnect.